recording.
Okay, I was going to remind you.
And I don't know, with mine, sometimes you get a pop-up that you have to just say okay to about the recording. So FYI. But John, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen again here.
I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
All right, let me.
We're getting closer. I say PowerPoint now.
Okay.
There you go, John.
Okay, very good. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so very much for inviting me to come back and speak to you once again. And I just want to sort of preface this presentation by saying this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. When we get into the presentation, you'll have to forgive me on occasion because I'm going to jump on a soapbox and get a little animated and emotional about some of the topics here. But what's interesting, and I'm not going to dwell here on my background. I introduced myself to you guys earlier in the year. The one thing I do want to share, though, is that I spent 35 years at Pennsylvania Power and Light in the IT department. And the last 10 years I was with PP&L. I was the Chief Information Officer of PP&L's international operations. And during those 10 years, I lived in Argentina for a couple of years. I lived in Santiago, Chile for a couple of years. And then for the better part of 6 years, I traveled 26 weeks out of every year and absolutely loved it. And the only reason I took early retirement from PP&L is because the executives at PP&L were persuaded by the analysts on Wall Street that the companies PP&L owned in Latin America represented a risk. And so they persuaded the executives to divest themselves of the international operations. And at that point, I was literally a fish out of water. And after having traveled the world for the better part of 10 years, going into the same office and sitting behind the same desk was just not something I wanted to do. But the interesting thing is that having grown up through the ranks of project management until I became an executive and fulfilled the role of executive sponsor, I realized that in many organizations, there is no training provided to executives on what it means to be a sponsor of a project. And not to suggest that executives are bad people or stupid people in any way. It's just that there is no training provided. So I did a significant amount of research and discovered that there really is not formal training for executives. And so I sat down and developed a class, a 3-day class that I teach at Lehigh University in their executive education program. And what I'm going to share with you over the next 45 minutes is a compressed, condensed version of what is now a 2-day class that I teach at Lehigh. And I offer that if any of you are interested, one of my recommendations at the end of this presentation will be that you provide or you develop or you ensure that your executives receive training in some fashion when they become sponsors of projects. Because if they don't, or absent such training, it's very likely that that the projects will fail. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, as I mentioned, the better part of my career involved international operations, either managing projects or programs in, at this latest count, I think there are some 30 different countries represented on this map. And in many cases, and I would say at least in half of them, my role was as executive sponsor of projects. And so If at some point you guys would like to have me come back, I have yet another presentation which talks about the unique challenges of managing international or global projects. And so I'd be happy to share that with you as well. As always, I want to give credit where credit is due. And so the content that I'm going to share with you over the next several minutes draws in large part on two books. One is called Project Sponsorship, an essential guide for those sponsoring projects within their organizations. An excellent book, highly recommended. I've read it multiple times. And then The Power of Project Leadership. I also mentioned this book when I spoke to you guys earlier in the year. Susan Madsen is a colleague of mine, and an excellent, excellent book. And then, of course, the third source is the class that I developed in cooperation with a couple of other colleagues. And so that's titled the Executive Project Sponsorship Certificate, offered through the Executive Education Department at Lehigh University. And this is just a little blurb about it. And this is, if you go to their website, this describes the sort of the syllabus of the project, of the program, of the class, and who should attend and exactly what they are going to learn from it. But again, over the next 45 minutes, we'll touch on many of the key elements of this. And a couple of thoughts, again, before we get into the presentation full bore. I always provide more content in my presentations than we will be able to cover in detail in the next 45 minutes. And I do that for two reasons. One, I want you to have this information. And two, I want to give you a reason to go back and read the presentation after the fact. And I have already sent a PDF copy of this presentation to Andy. And so that will be made available to all of you. So exactly what are we going to be talking about? The first and foremost is, what is the imperative? Why exactly are we talking about this topic at all? What are the roles and responsibilities of a project sponsor? And then literally going through a life cycle, a traditional life cycle of a project. What are the sponsor's roles during project governance or project selection? And then what are the sponsor's roles during project planning, project execution, and finally project closure? And I'll leave you with some closing thoughts at the end, some specific recommendations that I feel very strongly each one of you should ensure are acted upon or implemented within your respective organizations. And then, as always, I provide some sources, both books and online resources that I recommend that you seek out. And then, of course, we'll have time at the end for questions and comments. So exactly why are we here? What are we going to be talking about? Some interesting quotations here. Projects drive business innovation and change. In fact, the only way that organizations can change, implement a strategy, innovate, or gain competitive advantage is through projects. And as it goes on to say, the next untapped candidate for significant improvement in a company's pursuit of competitiveness is the project activity of the organization. Now, we all know that we can do better. A recent study from the PMI discovered that only 38% of projects finish on time within budget, and only 65% of them meet their original goal and business intent. So having learned that not every project ends successfully and succeeds, the obvious question is why? And as we'll see in just a second, executive sponsorship is the number one reason that projects fail to meet the business objectives for which they were justified. But I want to stress this particular slide. Projects have become the essential part of any organization, and it is predicted that by 2025, just 3 or 4 years from now, senior leaders and managers will spend at least 60% of their time selecting, prioritizing, and overseeing the execution of projects. This is, in fact, a massive disruption that will impact how organizations are managed. And for those of us involved in project management, this is wonderful news, because it says every aspect of our lives is becoming a set of projects. Now, What exactly does it mean for an executive to spend 60% of his or her time involved in the oversight of projects? Most project sponsors, unfortunately, feel that the role of being a project sponsor consists of sitting through boring status meetings and signing checks, whereas in fact, it is an active, ongoing, critical element to the success of each and every project. In the organization that I'm currently working with, Computer Aid, we've done a lot of research. And in pursuing our research, we discovered work that was done by Dr. Leon Kappelman at the University of North Texas. And he analyzed hundreds upon hundreds of failed IT projects to identify what were the root causes of those projects failing to meet their business objectives. And more importantly, what early warning signs could have been put in place to identify a potentially failing project in time to set it right. And this really struck me. The number one reason that projects fail to meet their objectives is lack of top management support or commitment to the project. When I read this, when I learned this from Dr. Kappelman, that's what prompted me to do some research and discover that virtually no university provides training in project sponsorship. And I really couldn't find very many businesses that provide comprehensive training to their executives as they rise from middle management to senior management in what it means to sponsor a project. Now, I did discover one or two businesses that provide essentially a checklist to executives, but none provide formal training on what it means, which again was the motivation for me to put together the class. Now, it's not just Dr. Kappelman's research. The Project Management Institute itself commissioned a book a few years ago that was developed by five PhDs. And the title of the book is Early Warning Signs in Complex Projects. And again, the number one cause of project failure, if you read the upper left cell here, sponsor with unclear expectations and unclear role, specifically what it means to be a project sponsor. And another study I recently uncovered from the Peloton Consulting Group says that while much has been written about the art of project management and specifically the role and responsibilities of the project manager, much less has been done to truly advise on the critical role, responsibilities, and regular activities of the executive sponsor. Therefore, there is considerable opportunity to improve project performance by providing greater attention to the definition and preparation of the executive sponsor. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the project sponsor at a very high level? Before we get into the specifics of his or her responsibilities throughout the life of the project. This is a pretty good definition of the project sponsor. It's an individual who justifies and enables a project to become established and then who oversees and maintains corporate accountability for it. Now, again, I'm not going to read all these slides to you. I provide this information because I really want you to then go back and reread these in more detail. It's an active senior management role responsible for identifying the business need, problem, or opportunity, then ensuring that the project remains a viable proposition. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The responsibilities of the sponsor include identifying the business need, own the business case for the project, hire or in some cases select from a pool of available project managers, the project manager. Translation, we'll talk about that a lot as we go through this, and then ensure that resources are available to the project. And by resources, we mean people, money, training, equipment, tools, and most importantly, priority. The executive sponsor's role involves leadership, establish clear expectations, resources, provide the resources of the right people and funding, and then demonstrate visible support and champion change and the need for following PM practices and processes. And so it's a very visible role. And there's an obvious question. Why is the project sponsor's role so important? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all of us want to work on things that are important to the person who either directly or indirectly signs our paycheck. And I think equally important, if the project is no longer that important to the project sponsor, he or she will not go out of his or her way to provide the resources that are needed, or to serve as a champion for the project, to persuade his or her peers that this project is important to the organization, deserves a high priority, and deserves the attention of the or other organizations that are going to be impacted by it. And in what that includes is making sure that subject matter experts are made available when and as needed by the project. So if you want to show a single slide to your executives and say, this is what we expect of you as a project sponsor, here are some of the behaviors that we would expect a project sponsor to demonstrate continuously throughout the life of the project. Now, another way to look at this is to say that the sponsor's role during the project is to be a visionary, to present and sell his or her vision of what this project is going to contribute to the organization, and defend that project to his or her peers repeatedly and continuously. Obviously be a banker, unblock any impediment to the success of the project, mediate disputes that are inevitably going to occur throughout the life of the project, be a planner and be a leader. And we'll talk about these in a little more detail. What should the project sponsor do throughout the project? Number one at the bottom is communicating. It is vital that the project sponsor serve as a cheerleader for the project, because even though the project ideally will have been selected from a list of other candidate projects, and its business case will have been clear to those who had a vote in whether this project was selected, people tend to have short memories. And so it's really incumbent on the sponsor to continuously remind the other executives why this project was chosen and what benefits are going to derive from it when it is completed successfully. Now, I mentioned communication and translation. Every project develops project speak, and the project manager is communicating with his or her team in a downward fashion, in a very condensed form of vocabulary. Typically, projects are just entail an awful lot of acronyms or special vocabulary, and the project manager and the project sponsor have to communicate using that same language. But it is then the project sponsor's responsibility to translate that project speak into business terminology, into the phrases, the terminology, the language of that particular organization, that particular business, and communicate the status of the project and the benefits that it will derive in business terms to the other executives. So the translation responsibility of the sponsor is one that really has to be stressed and cannot be minimized. Now, what's the difference between project sponsorship and project management? Sponsorship is the ownership of the project on behalf of the organization. It includes identifying, defining the project. Project management, on the other hand, is concerned with delivering a project successfully that has already been defined. And the second bullet here is one I really want to stress. The project sponsor is responsible for the project's business case, and the sponsor should never hesitate for even a moment to recommend canceling the project if the business case no longer justifies the project. Let me tell you a true story. A couple of years ago, when I was teaching this class at Lehigh, one of the executives taking the class was a senior executive at a large candy manufacturing company located in Pennsylvania. And they have a policy as part of their project governance methodology to review the business case of every project on at least a bi-monthly basis. And the assumption is, or the understanding, I should say, is that things change, conditions change. The assumptions that were true when the project was first justified and selected and authorized through no fault of anyone within the organization may have changed. And so they revisit the business case and the rationale for every one of their projects in flight every 2 months. And if the business case is no longer valid, or this is no longer the best use of their resources, they don't hesitate for a moment to cancel those projects. And then they do something that I had never heard of before. They celebrate that fact. They actually hold a celebration which says we now are able to free up people and money and other resources and devote them to other projects that may be in flight, or other projects that were candidate projects that were not authorized, that now all of a sudden may yield a better business benefit. And so the project sponsor, as it says here, should never hesitate to recommend canceling the project if the business case no longer is justifiable. Really recommend you take that to heart. I just thought when I heard that from that executive that was just a wonderful aspect of their governance process. Oops. I am struggling here. Not sure why this is. I'm sorry. Okay, sponsor's role during project governance. In light of what we just talked about, I love this quotation. There is nothing so useless as doing well or efficiently that which should not be done at all. And what this means is that even before a project is initiated, even before a project is approved, it is the sponsor's role to ensure that that project is the best use of the organization's resources. And so during the project governance phase, and don't ever forget that there are two aspects of project governance. There's the demand side, which asks, are we doing the right projects? And then there is the supply side of governance, which asks, are we doing those projects right? And the sponsor has to be, is responsible for both aspects of governance. So on the supply side of governance, on the, excuse me, the demand side of governance, projects should be clearly linked to key business objectives. There should be clear senior management ownership, and they should be justified by a valid business case. So exactly how does a sponsor evaluate an idea for a project? Well, here are a couple of recommended questions that you might want to ask or ensure that your sponsor asks. Is it aligned with the organization's strategy? Will it accomplish specific measurable targets? What priority should be given to it? What are the consequences of not doing it? And let me give you another example. When I worked at PMINEO, we owned 5 different electric distribution companies in Latin America, including one in El Salvador. And during that time, Sarbanes-Oxley was introduced by the US Senate. And every American company had no choice but to implement Sarbanes-Oxley. And you also had to implement it at any wholly owned subsidiary that you had internationally. Well, the cost of implementing Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, both processes and software, at this one particular company we owned in El Salvador was more than the revenue, the profit of that company in a year. And so we really did make a conscious decision. Do we consciously run the risk of being fined for not having implemented Sarbanes-Oxley in that particular subsidiary, or do we do the right thing and invest in it and implement it and eliminate the possibility that we would be fined? In the long run, we took the high road and we implemented Sarbanes-Oxley, but really doing so was the answer to one of these questions. What are the consequences of not doing it? And so you really have to ask yourself, is the risk of incurring what may occur with the project justifiable or not? And so don't ever forget that there are only 3 reasons for undertaking a business project. And those three are increase revenue, lower cost, or reduce risk. And so the business case has to address one or more of these three reasons, three rationales for undertaking a business project. Now, I mentioned that there were basically two sides to governance. There is the side that says, are we doing the right projects? And then there is the side that says, are we doing those projects right? And so the other side of governance that the sponsor has to take ownership of is ensuring that the project is managed per the methodology, per the standards of the organization. Ideally, this would be defined by a PMO, but absent a PMO, it is still the sponsor's role to ensure that governance occurs throughout the life of the project. And so the obvious question is, why project governance? Well, a governance framework provides the project manager and team with structured processes, ensuring that the best practices of the organization and the best practices of project management as a discipline are brought to bear on each and every project. And as it says at the bottom here, governance provides important deliverable acceptance criteria and measures to assess the benefits and success of the project. Without a governance process, it's impossible to know whether the project has succeeded when it ends. And so who is responsible for project governance? Again, I'm not going to read this entirely, but the very last item here, let there be no misunderstanding. It is the project sponsor who is responsible for ensuring that project governance occurs. I think I related the story to you guys. A colleague and I were invited to New York City a couple of years ago to meet with the chief technology officer of one of the three major networks. And he confided in us that unfortunately he didn't have confidence in his project managers that they could manage the project team or the project itself. What he told us was that I really can only count on them to manage the project schedule or the project plan. And unfortunately, it then fell to the project sponsor to manage the project team and the project itself. And the project sponsors, executives said, that's not my job. I'm not going to do that. So what we told him is that he could either implement a project governance process, or he could hire project managers who in essence were project leaders and could in fact lead the project team and lead the project itself. But the bottom line here is that absent a PMO that would have taken that stance, it was up to the project sponsors of the business units to ensure that a project leader was hired to ensure that the project was being managed adequately and that governance was being applied. Now, I'm not going to give you, go into the detail here, but here are some elements of a project governance framework that I would encourage you to review. To the extent that you don't have a project governance framework in your organization, this would provide a good checklist for that. Now, project governance versus project management. What exactly is the relationship? Well, I mentioned that you have a governance process that defines what project metrics to measure. The sponsor then selects from those measurements that are supported by the project governance process and the methodology of the organization. Project management is responsible for continuously measuring each of those metrics and providing data upward. And then the project team is providing data for the metrics. So the project sponsor at the outset of a project, very much like Jim Phelps at the beginning of a Mission Impossible program, had to sit through a dossier and flip through the metrics that are supported by the organization and select those that are appropriate for his or her project. And that then becomes the way the project is monitored, measured, and when it ends, determines whether it was successful or not. Now, the project lifecycle stages. I'm not going to belabor these. All of you have PMP certifications, therefore you know these. You probably have them tattooed someplace on your body. But the 5 phases: initiation, planning, execution, control, and closure. So let's talk about these a little bit in more detail. specifically with respect to what is the sponsor's role during each of those phases. During initiation and planning, you can read in the orange columns here. These are some of the tasks or activities that are involved in that particular phase. But planning is very, very important. I love some of these quotations. In preparing for battle, I have always found that project plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. In war, there are two kinds of plans, those that might work and those that won't work. You want to pick a plan that might work and then make it work. So planning of a project is really important. And unfortunately, all too often, sponsors don't understand or realize or appreciate that they are involved and must be involved in that as well. So I'm going to give you a couple of opportunities for the executive to weigh in during project planning. And again, I'm not going to dwell on these in a lot of detail. Assess the, the project idea, commission the charter, vet the charter, ensure there's budgeting, be the champion, select the project leader, basically the project manager, arrange how the project will be conducted and measured. This is the ongoing project governance, and then make go, no-go decisions continuously throughout the life of the project. So the critical role of the project sponsor during planning and preparation, ensure that only worthwhile project ideas are approved, build consensus, make sure that project is planned for success, provide executive support throughout the life of the project, maintain organizational accountability, and then celebrate success when the project ends. Now, one of the most important documents that the sponsor owns and has to own is the project charter. It's basically the contract that authorizes the existence of the project, clarifies what will be accomplished, aligns measurement, management, and project team expectations, and then avoids any misunderstandings. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. The key ingredients of a project charter. If any of you are interested in having a template for a project charter, simply send me an email. I'll be happy to send you one. When I teach this class at Lehigh, we provide templates for virtually all of these major documents. But unfortunately, too often sponsors think that it's the project manager's role to develop the project charter, and it's not. The project sponsor has to own this document. So ensure that scope is clearly defined, objectives, benefits, alignment with the organization, and then risk mitigation, risk management. Again, this is an element of the project charter. All too often, this is overlooked or it's not fully documented. And what's an interesting element here is that there are two kinds of reserves for dealing with risks. One is a contingency reserve, which is typically included in the project cost estimate and is controlled by the project manager. And what we are recommending is that there be an executive option, a management reserve that is not part of the project budget, but is rather controlled by the project sponsor and a project oversight board. Now, selecting the project manager. And don't ever forget that I really don't like the term project manager, because as I stressed when I gave the presentation on project leadership, successful projects are led, not managed. And you may recall this particular slide in which I compare the skills that we normally expect of our project managers in the column on the left, and the skills that I argue are absolutely necessary in the project leader in the column on the right. So I'm not going to belabor the point here, not to dwell on it, but it is important, in my opinion, that the project sponsor select a project leader, one who can truly lead the project team, lead the project itself, and not simply be a project administrator. So what to look for in a project leader? One who has successfully run similar projects, possesses and has demonstrated strong interpersonal skills, ideally has solid project management credentials, And I understand that in many organizations, the project sponsor doesn't have the flexibility of hiring or contracting for a project manager. Very often the project manager is assigned to a project, typically by a PMO. An ideal situation, however, is where the project sponsor can choose the project manager such that the project manager clearly is beholden to the project sponsor. That's the ideal situation. Now, how will the project be conducted and measured? There has to be a strong and healthy working relationship, communication relationship between the project sponsor and the project manager. We already talked about some of these: determining the metrics that will determine the project success, decide who will keep each key stakeholder informed, and determine the specific help that the project manager would like from the sponsor in the event that there are organizational obstacles. This chart I put together to help clearly illustrate for both the project sponsor and the project manager the relationship they have with each other. Who is specifically responsible for each of these rows, each of these tasks? And this really is a very good communication tool to sit down with a newly appointed executive and help him or her understand the scope, the complexity, the time-consuming aspect of being a project sponsor. There are 10 ways for an executive to help a project be successful during this planning phase. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail. I encourage you to go back and read them when you have time. Confirm that the project is adequately resourced, ensure that there's an effective communication plan, and provide strong executive support. At the same time, there are 10 ways for an executive to doom a project during the planning stage, such as failing to provide sufficient resources, not getting buy-in of stakeholders and providing executive support, etc. So again, a really good checklist for how a project sponsor can help ensure the success of a project during the planning phase, or can do, typically through inattention or lack of understanding, things that can doom the project literally from day one that the project sponsor has failed to take action on. Now, during project execution, unfortunately, I can hear a project sponsor saying, "Are you kidding me? You expected me to do the project charter. You expected me to write the business case. You expected me to defend and justify this project. You expected me to have an active role in planning. Now the project's underway, I get to relax and I'm not involved." Right? Wrong. Unfortunately, throughout the execution phases of the project, there continue to be very strong demands on the project sponsor. So let's look at them in a little bit more detail. Basically, there are 5. One having to do with assuring the quality of the deliverables, the output from the project, continuing to be a champion and strategist, continuing to influence his or her peers in terms of ensuring that resources are available when and as needed by the project, making multiple decisions, especially decisions related to scope, and then finally being a gatekeeper for all of the assets and resources that are needed for the project. So to carry out the project sponsor is the manager who with a demonstrated interest in the outcome, whereas the project manager is responsible for ensuring that the project team completes the project work. The project sponsor is the vocal and visible champion, legitimizing the project's goals and alignment to corporate objectives. The project manager, on the other hand, is responsible for working the project plan with the team and manages the team's performance. The project sponsor, as an influencer, supports the project manager, removes obstacles, provides clear direction, and reinforces the project importance up and down the organization. That's the translation and cheerleader, the communication role that I talked about earlier. Whereas the project manager is responsible for communicating status upward to the project sponsor, maintaining a continuous observation of the triggers that would indicate that a risk is no longer a possibility, but is now a real event. The project sponsor is a decision maker throughout the execution phase of the project, aware of major milestones, acts decisively when changes and challenges or risks are presented. And then finally, he or she is a gatekeeper, responsible for signing off on major deliverables, approving that the project is ready to proceed to the next phase. So as you can see, there are ongoing and time-consuming and continuous responsibilities of the sponsor, not simply sitting in boring status meetings and signing checks. Now, the sponsor's role in project closure. Ensure that the project is officially finished. Allocate proper staff as needed to support the ongoing needs of the project. Very often overlooked, especially in IT projects. There's a tendency to say that the system has been implemented, the code has been put in production, we're done. Well, in fact, we're not done. This is only the beginning. We have to ensure that there is an ongoing support organization, that the organizational or business changes that were part and parcel of the project have in fact been implemented and completed successfully, that training has been completed. So there are a lot of ongoing things that have to be done when, even after the project itself may be declared over and successful. Confirm the budget and address return on investment. Confirm appropriate archival of any project documentation. Ideally, this would be overseen by the PMO, but again, absent an active and effective PMO, very often these tasks fall on the shoulders of the project sponsor. Finalize any vendor relationships that were part of the project. Realize the project's full benefit, and then finally celebrate success. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have in the initial project budget an allocated sum such that when the project is successfully completed, there is money available to celebrate it in a meaningful way. And the larger the project, the longer its duration, the more it's important not only to celebrate the completion of the entire project, but to celebrate individual milestones that lead up to the successful conclusion of the project. So some closing thoughts. Again, I'm going to repeat this because I just find it so compelling. By 2025, senior leaders and managers will spend at least 60% of their time overseeing projects. The important message here is that unless executives begin successfully to delegate what they do on a day in, day out basis, they will not have time to dedicate adequately to oversight of projects. And so what this means is that the role of executives is going to change. Many of the day-to-day activities will either have to be assigned to others or pushed further down in the organization so that executives can embrace the role of project sponsor and fully execute it as needed throughout the project. And don't forget, the reason we're having this conversation at all is because the number one reason for projects failing to meet their business objectives is lack of senior management support. And again, to repeat myself, it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're stupid people. It's because no one has thought to provide training to them in what it means to sponsor a project. So my recommendations: every organization should provide training to senior management in the role and responsibilities of project sponsorship, including, excuse me, project governance, meaning project selection and prioritization, the execution side of project governance, which means project execution excellence. That means that you should employ advanced project management, or PM 2.0, promote project leadership as opposed to project management, and leverage the early warning signs of project failure. Again, I have an entire presentation on what that means and what the early warning signs are and how to implement them. Finally, with resources, make sure that there are adequate people, funds, tools, technology, training, etc. Whatever it takes to make this project successful, make sure that it's there when and as needed. Make decisions in a prompt and executive fashion, and be a champion and communicator. So I promised some sources. Here are some books I highly recommend. I have read all of them, most of them multiple times, and then some online resources that I also recommend. And with that, I would like to open the floor to any questions that you might have, any comments that you either agree with me, or even more interesting, if you disagree with me.
Well, to go ahead and get things started, John, I'm going to kind of ask the what I feel is the obvious question, and that is, how do some of us as project managers try to deal or address issues where we are not having proper project sponsorship? What are some thoughts on how we can try to address those issues, correct them, so on and so forth?
Well, I can take the easy way out and say that you as a project manager need to take the bull by the horns and confront your project sponsor with some of the documentation I've just provided you, and explain that it's not enough for you as a project sponsor to sit in status meetings. I need more of you. I need you to be a cheerleader. I need you to promote the project across the organization. I need resources to be available when they're needed. I need you to make decisions in a timely fashion. It's easy for me to sit here and say that's what you as a project manager should do. I know that's not easy. What I would do is I would approach my PMO and I would lay this responsibility on their shoulders and say, every time a project is initiated or proposed, and it gets through the governance process, the project selection process, and a project sponsor is assigned, you as the PMO should sit down with that individual and provide a checklist, provide some training in what it means to be a sponsor. Now, in a really great organization, that training would be developed and it would be provided to all executives as they rise through the ranks and approach the point where they will in fact be sponsors of a project. The alternative is to suggest that your executives attend training either at some local university or bring someone in to do the training, because typically executives feel very uncomfortable when they're in a class with the project manager, maybe some project team members. On the other hand, when they're in a class with their peers, it's really a very comfortable setting, a very comfortable environment. It's non-threatening, and even more so when they're in a class with executives from other organizations, other companies that are in completely different fields. And then they can actually share experiences with one another. So it's a long answer to a very good question. And the obvious question is, the follow-on should be, okay, I hear what you say, but I've still got a lousy sponsor who doesn't really care about my project, doesn't devote adequate time to it. What do I do? If you're a contract project manager, quite honestly, you should walk away because your project is probably not going to succeed and you don't want to have that associated with you.
Are there any other questions? Would anyone else like to ask, or is there information anyone else is looking to try to obtain? If
Well,
so,
let
please.
me I'm sorry, Andy, let me prime the pump. Let me ask the audience, do any of you provide sponsorship training to your executives? Do any of you work for an organization that provides that kind of training?
Hi, John Tabali here again with Progressive Insurance. We have some documentation on the expected roles of a sponsor, both business sponsor and IT sponsor, that I've used to just at the very beginning when I'm assigned to kind of set the foundation for the expectations. And it's pretty good. I think looking at some of this, there might be an opportunity to bolster it a little bit, but we do have some of that already. And sponsors, there are active sessions out there to sort of train sponsors on their expectations as well, with that documentation as a basis.
Great. Would anyone else like to contribute?
Again, I'll throw a question out. Do those of you who are project managers feel that you have the kind of support from your sponsors that you need?
Hi, this is Justin Dwayne, and for me it's I work on projects that are client facing, so a lot of it gets determined by the sponsors on the client side. So that can be an interesting dynamic when it's not an internal kind of fix our organization or better our organization. So just wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. It makes for a more challenging relationship, but I don't think any of the responsibilities change. I still think that the the individual who is in the role of project sponsor has the responsibility to do all the things that I talked about. And unfortunately, often that executive doesn't feel he or she has the time, but someone's going to have to do it. And so I guess I feel as strongly as before that training like this is necessary, regardless of whether the sponsor is an internal executive or someone from the client.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Would anyone else like to speak up?
Yeah, hi, this is Joe Haberman. I had a question regarding the additional literature that you're going to be providing. Is there, if we only have time to review one, do you recommend one more than another?
Well, I mean, the ideal would be if you could read the book that about project sponsorship. I mean, it's a fairly thick book. I guess my suggestion would be get the book and just either read some of the initial chapters or the final chapters. But there's a lot to it. I mean, there are a lot of responsibilities, a lot of tasks, and maybe the best thing is to sit down with your PMO, assuming you have a PMO, and review the template that you use as the project charter. Review the project governance process, and make sure that in every instance the responsibilities of the sponsors are clearly identified, and perhaps cull them out of those various documents to prepare a little mini manual for executives saying, this is what we expect of you, or this is what is expected of you at each of the phases of a project. And here's an example of a project charter. Here's an example of a project business case, and try to make it as easy for them as possible.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
John, you mentioned risk before. I was just, I thought maybe you could go a little further with that. I think we know as PMs, we're expected to handle risk and identify the risks and, do some analysis to quantify those risks. But you did mention also that the sponsor has a role in that. And I just wondered if you can help me just sort of understand, as you see it, the difference between the sponsor role and the project manager's role in risk management.
One thing, kind of not answering the question, but something I wanted to mention during the presentation with respect to risk. One of the best techniques I've ever heard for identifying potential risks on a project is called a pre-mortem. We've all heard of a post-mortem. In other words, after the project ends, what went well, what didn't go well. But I encourage you to Google a pre-mortem risk analysis. It was actually a process developed by a professor at Harvard, and she and some of her colleagues developed this. And basically, what you do in a pre-mortem is you imagine everything that possibly could go wrong with a project. And one simple example is one of the things I do is teach at the Global Village, which is part of the Iacocca Institute at Lehigh. And we bring young professionals from 100 different countries for a mini MBA resident at Lehigh University. And at the end of half of the activity of the Global Village is to do a real project for a real business. And then at the end of the 6-week session, the project team presents their findings and recommendations to the board of directors of whatever the company is. And so we encourage the team to do a pre-mortem risk analysis on that presentation. And so you imagine things like the one person who was going to be speaking woke up that day with laryngitis. What do we do? Or the one computer that has the presentation on it dropped out of the van and was driven over. What do we do? Or the the thumb drive that has the presentation on it just suddenly snapped in half. And so you, rather than assume that all these things didn't happen, you assume that they all did happen in the worst negative way, and therefore what mitigation strategy can you put in place? And so what I would recommend to a sponsor is that the sponsor host a pre-mortem activity, sort of gather the project team together and say, this is what this project is supposed to accomplish. These are the things we're going to develop and deliver. Let's do a pre-mortem what if analysis and just do a sort of a whiteboard. All the things that possibly could go wrong, let's identify them, and then we'll make sure that we have a mitigation or avoidance strategy in place for each and every one of them.
Thank you.
Maybe kind of elaborating upon that, John, and kind of tying back to your May presentation on you can't manage a project to success. Basically, you need to be a project leader. As more of us kind of find ourselves transitioning into more of that project leader, and in some cases, maybe assuming some of the project sponsor roles, where do we, as project managers, need to kind of try to draw the line between being the sponsor and seeking help from that sponsor and being the project manager?
Well, the real difference between the project sponsor and the project manager is one of resources. You've all heard the phrase that unless you are signing a check, you're really just talking about it. And so you're a project manager if you're given resources and expected to use those resources to accomplish something. You are a project sponsor if you control those resources and have the authority to make them available to a project team. And so I think there's a pretty clear point at which you are promoted from project manager to project sponsor, and that really has to do with delegation of authority. If you control the resources, you are the project sponsor.
Okay. Any additional questions?
Well, I just want to say one more time, I very much appreciate you guys inviting me back. It's a subject I feel very, very strongly about, and it's one that I think if given additional attention by PMI can go a long way toward improving the success rate of projects.
I agree. Unless there's any additional questions, I'm going to kind of move on. We will be sending out an email later this week that will have the information on how to claim your PDUs for this session. We will also be attaching John's presentation so that you can do the additional deeper dive into the individual slides. And we will eventually be posting the recording of the presentation on the PMI website. I unfortunately need to rely upon others to do so. So hopefully by the end of the week or the beginning of next week, those things will be up and posted. But unless people have additional questions, I don't really have anything else to report. The next slide is just basically how to handle reporting your own PDUs, which I think most of us know how to do at this point. And outside of that, I'd just like to thank John once again for presenting to the chapter. We truly appreciate your insights on these subjects. And unless there's additional questions, I'll go ahead and stay online and keep the session open for another few minutes if someone was maybe a little bashful and wanted to ask additional questions, or if you want to put things in the chat box, please feel free to do so. Other than that concludes this evening's session. I thank you everybody for attending.
And with that, Andy, I think I'm going to drop off as well.
Okay, John, thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. Sorry that they weren't a little more talkative.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
You really presented some great information. And again, we'll be sending it out to everyone who was in attendance for the meeting. And again, thank you again for all of your time. I truly appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. Hopefully we can do it again.
Absolutely.
Okay. Good night,
Thanks.
everyone.
Mm-hmm.